Well, that's right. The leaders of this team say what they've found is very exciting and very convincing.
They vanished without a trace. 115 men, women, and children. Gone. No bodies, no graves. Only a single word carved into a tree. Croatoan. A secret token, he called it, left behind as a sign. There it was, Croatoan, etched into the post. It seemed to offer an answer, but it answered nothing. For centuries, the disappearance of the Roanoke colony remained America's most chilling enigma. One of its oldest unsolved mysteries, and it happened right here, in our own backyard. Now, in 2025, the silence has been shattered. What scientists uncovered isn't just shocking, it's terrifying. It began in the blistering summer of 1587. Under the harsh Atlantic sun, 3 English ships glided through the shallows and anchored off Roanoke Island, a wild, untamed spit of land off what is now North Carolina. Aboard were 115 souls, not conquerors, but dreamers. They stepped into the unknown, each carrying the fragile hope of a new beginning. This was not the first attempt. 2 previous efforts had failed, consumed by violence, starvation, and chaos. But this time, it felt different. Led by the thoughtful and steady John White, these settlers came with families, not soldiers. They came to build, not to conquer. At the heart of their arrival was a symbol of promise. Virginia Dare, White's granddaughter, the first English child born on American soil. Her birth wasn't just a celebration, it was a declaration. England intended to stay. Under the shade of towering trees, they built a modest fort, planted crops, and cautiously reached out to nearby tribes. The land was wild, beautiful, and unforgiving, yet they endured. And then, just as the roots of their new lives began to hold, White left for England to gather more supplies. He expected to return in a few months, but Europe was burning. England was locked in a deadly struggle with Spain. Queen Elizabeth I had seized every ship for war. White was stranded. 3 helpless years, counting the days, haunted by what might be happening across the sea. When he finally returned in August of 1590, he was met with an unbearable stillness. The harbor lay undisturbed. The fort stood just as he had left it, palisades upright, gates intact, but the people were gone. No laughter, no voices, no smoke rising from chimneys. The land seemed to recoil from him, as if guarding a secret. No signs of battle, no blood, no wreckage. No graves, just a single word carved into wood, Croatoan, and 3 unfinished letters, cross on a nearby tree. White's heart pounded. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, home to a friendly indigenous tribe. It was also their agreed-upon sign, where to go if they had to leave. There was no cross, no mark of danger. Maybe they had gone willingly. Maybe they were still alive. But fate refused to cooperate. A storm rolled in as White prepared to sail to Croatoan. The anchor broke, supplies vanished, the crew refused to continue. With a heavy heart and no answers, White returned to England. He would never return. What remains is his journal, filled with unease and quiet despair. It wasn't what he found that haunted him, it was what he didn't. And because of that, an entire colony, England's fragile foothold in the New World, was swallowed whole. Over the centuries, Roanoke became a whisper, then a riddle. Historians searched, theories spiraled. By the early 1600s, rumors reached Jamestown. Settlers spoke of tribes with gray eyes, speaking broken English, claiming descent from white ancestors. Some bore lighter features, unusual among local populations. And there were whispers of old maps, of distant villages arranged with uncanny symmetry, too perfect to be native-made. But every trail faded into mist, every clue dissolved, every lead ended in ash. In time, the theories turned darker. Some claimed the colonists had been slaughtered after fragile diplomacy with local tribes collapsed. Others whispered of starvation, of madness and cannibalism gnawing at the edges of reason during a brutal winter. A few pointed to the Spanish, known to patrol the Atlantic coast in silence, erasing rival settlements without leaving a trace. And then came stranger rumors of ancient curses, of sacred grounds disturbed, of land itself rejecting the settlers like a body expelling disease. Even with no clear answers, the search never truly stopped. Excavations continued. Archaeologists scoured Roanoke and the surrounding lands, turning over every stone. They unearthed fragments of pottery, rusted weapons, scattered beads, pieces of a puzzle that might belong to the vanished colonists. Or might not. The line between evidence and legend blurred until it was razor thin, just like the Dare Stone. In 1937, it surfaced a carved rock, bearing a chilling message said to be from Eleanor Dare, mother of Virginia. It told of death, of disease, of unbearable loss. The nation was spellbound. Then came more stones. Too many. Suspicion followed. Most were labeled hoaxes. Perhaps all. Hope gave way to doubt, yet Roanoke clung to the American psyche. A mystery balanced perfectly between fact and fable, speculation and silence. Time marched on. Science advanced. DNA testing was proposed. LiDAR scanned through forest canopies. Ground-penetrating radar swept the Carolina coast. Still no answers. An entire colony had vanished into the trees, leaving behind only questions. Then came the map. Like many discoveries, it started quietly. In 2012, a researcher at the British Museum re-examined a centuries-old watercolor titled La Virginia Pars, created by John White himself. The map, fragile and long-studied, seemed unchanged. Until that day, a subtle patch near the edge, almost invisible, drew attention. Using backlighting to expose hidden sketches and erased marks, the researcher uncovered it, a faint outline of a square-shaped fort, hidden beneath the surface. The ink, likely iron gall or another fading compound, had preserved its secret. And the location? Exactly 50 miles west of Roanoke Island. That number matched a cryptic line in White's journal. Before his departure, he recorded that the colonists intended to move 50 miles into the Main. The phrase, long dismissed, suddenly pulsed with new significance. Why had he hidden it? Some speculated White was protecting the fort's location, from Spanish spies perhaps. Others believed he never returned because he feared what he might find, a failed settlement or something far worse. That faded map, once just a relic, had become a cipher in America's oldest mystery. The archaeological world responded. The First Colony Foundation, a North Carolina-based group devoted to solving Roanoke, launched a full investigation. Under the leadership of archaeologist Nick Lucchetti, they focused on a stretch of land along the Albemarle Sound in Bertie County. It was there that whispers began again. This site was given a name that carried caution and curiosity, Site X. And with it, the ghosts of Bertie. Excavations began. Hopes were high, but skepticism lingered. The site was dense with pine, tangled in brush, far from the image of a classic English fort. At first, there were no walls, no gates, no battlements. But just beyond the fringe of an old native village called Metaquem, the soil began to stir. Fragments emerged, shards of English pottery buried deep beneath the surface. These were not decorative pieces or traded goods. They were utilitarian, bowls, jars, cooking pots. Many were coated in a green glaze, a hallmark of Surrey, Hampshire ware from the late 1500s. And one detail was conspicuously absent: clay tobacco pipes. Jamestown settlers who arrived in 1607 left behind pipes in abundance. But here, there were none. This wasn't a mistake. It was a clue, a timestamp. These artifacts didn't suggest casual visitors. They spoke of residents, of people who lived, cooked, and stored food here, people who stayed. Interest surged. The team expanded their search. Just 2 miles from Site X, another location stirred beneath the surface. They named it Site Y. The story grew wider. At Site Y, the artifacts shifted. European ceramics from various regions, hints of cultural merging, quiet traces that suggested the lost colony didn't vanish in a single stroke. It transformed. And so the question became louder. What if Roanoke was never lost? What if it simply changed? What if we were never meant to find it at all? Excavations began with anticipation, but also doubt. The dense pine, the tangled brush, the uneven earth, none of it resembled the clean-cut image of an English fort. As archaeologists peeled back layers of time, they found no walls, no trenches, no wooden barracks, nothing that definitively marked a colonial stronghold. But just beyond the boundary of an abandoned native village called Metaquim, the ground began to whisper its secrets. Beneath centuries of sediment, the earth gave up clues, fragments of English pottery buried deep, untouched by time's erosion. These weren't ornamental trinkets or trade goods, they were everyday tools, bowls, jars, cooking pots, all glazed in the telltale green of Surrey Hampshire ware from Elizabethan England. One absence spoke louder than all the artifacts: there were no clay tobacco pipes. At Jamestown, founded in 1607, such pipes littered the soil, remnants of a habit adopted by settlers. But here, in this older layer, the absence wasn't an oversight, it was a marker, a timestamp. These weren't left behind by later colonists, these belonged to someone else. Someone who lived, ate, and endured here. This was evidence of habitation, not visitation. Curiosity swelled. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed, and just 2 miles away, a new signal emerged, a second site. They called it Site Y. Here, the findings shifted. European ceramics from different regions emerged, subtle indicators of cross-cultural exchange. Layered into the soil was a quiet suggestion, not of destruction, but of change. Not an ending, but a transformation. A theory began to take root, one few dared to voice aloud. What if Roanoke wasn't a single tragedy, but a splintering? What if the colonists didn't vanish, but scattered? Some, perhaps, merging with native tribes like the Croatan, others moving deeper into the wild, building hidden outposts under the shelter of friendly tribal alliances. Site X and Site Y, separated by a thin stretch of forest and 4 centuries of silence, hinted at something profound. This wasn't collapse, it was fragmentation, not disappearance, transformation. And as the evidence grew, the story of Roanoke was no longer a mystery frozen in time, but a mosaic slowly being revealed, choice by desperate choice, fragment by buried fragment. But that was only one half of the enigma. While Site X captured headlines with its quiet revelations, another excavation stirred far to the southeast, on the windlassed shores of Hatteras Island, once known by another name, Croatan. Long whispered as the final refuge of the colonists, the island had always lived in the margins of legend. Now it was yielding hard evidence. At the center of the dig was British archaeologist Mark Horton, working closely with the Croatan Archaeological Society, led by local native Scott Dawson. Unlike Site X, where survival hinted at secrecy, the Hatteras site spoke of something else entirely: assimilation. Beneath the shifting sands, they unearthed relics, unmistakably English: a rusted rapier hilt, fragments of gun parts, and, most curiously, a slate writing tablet bearing faint scratches of English script. These weren't items traded and forgotten. These were tools, tokens of presence, proof that someone stayed. Even more compelling were the oral traditions carried by the Lumbee and other native communities. For generations, stories passed down spoke of white settlers who joined the Croatan people, who intermarried, had children, and never looked back. Dismissed for centuries as myth or hopeful legend, those stories now echoed with new resonance. Dawson's 2020 book, The Lost Colony in Hatteras Island, laid out the case with startling clarity. The colony hadn't perished, it had divided. Some fled west to Site X, but others, perhaps many more than ever believed, found shelter and a future among the Croatan. They weren't lost, they were hidden, right in plain sight, erased not by disaster, but by time, and by the slow neglect of history. And so came the boldest idea of all. What if both stories were true? What if Roanoke didn't fail, it evolved? To test this, archaeologists went beyond the shovel. They turned to science. Ground-penetrating radar scanned beneath the topsoil, detecting disturbances, old structures long collapsed. LiDAR swept the forest canopy away in digital layers, revealing post holes, fence lines, and long-forgotten hearths, ghosts of lives once lived. But the most haunting revelations came from the artifacts themselves. Researchers compared pottery shards, iron tools, and other fragments from sites X, Y, and Hatteras. They sought links, patterns, proof of shared origins. And as the connections grew, so did the question. What if the colony was never truly lost, only misremembered? Each fragment whispered, each line of pottery, each tool's edge told a story, one not of conquest or calamity, but of endurance, one not of failure, but of change. And in those whispers, the myth of Roanoke began to fracture, because perhaps they didn't disappear at all. Perhaps they adapted, perhaps they survived. Perhaps they were never lost, just waiting to be seen again. What they uncovered flipped the timeline upside down. At Roanoke-associated sites, the usual hallmarks of later English colonies, clay tobacco pipes, post-1600s ceramics, were completely absent. Instead, the artifacts pointed to a pre-1600 presence precisely aligning with the date the Roanoke settlers vanished. This was no remnant of a later migration. These were theirs. Then came the revelation that changed everything. DNA testing began to detect Western European genetic markers buried within local indigenous communities. These weren't echoes of 17th century colonization, they were older, deeply rooted, aligning eerily with 1587. At first, the implications were spoken in hushed tones. Then came the chilling realization, if this was true, then Jamestown in 1607, Plymouth in 1620, these weren't beginning, they were continuations. The first chapter of American history had been overwritten. But not everyone agreed. With each discovery came another wave of resistance. The mystery of Roanoke was no longer just historical, it had become ideological. Believers saw evidence and connection. Skeptics cried coincidence. Veteran archaeologist Dr. Charles Ewan cautioned against confirmation bias, warning they're trying to prove a theory, not disprove it. That's dangerous for science. Scott Dawson, a Croatan descendant and local historian, had always believed the answer was simple. They went to Croatan, he said, not deep inland, not into the unknown, to the island they had named in the carving, to allies. He dismissed Site X entirely. Too remote, too dangerous, surrounded by tribes they had alienated, it would have been a death sentence. Even within the first colony foundation, the Circe's spearhead, consensus fractured. One camp clung to the split colony theory. Some joined coastal tribes, others moved inland. Another rejected it, claiming the inland artifacts were remnants of earlier scouts, not settlers. The physical evidence offered no firm ground. A silver ring bearing a lion crest, a rusted English rapier hilt, pottery chemically linked to Elizabethan kilns, enough to suggest presence, never enough to prove it. Still, the tools sharpened. Ground-penetrating radar, drone mapping, mitochondrial DNA tracing, radiocarbon dating, soil chemistry, and the evidence kept accumulating, piece by piece, like ghost voices refusing to be silenced. Then came 2025, the year everything changed. The site was unremarkable, a patch of cold, winter soil by the Chowan River near elusive Site X. The team didn't expect much until they unearthed her, a burial. Supine, head to the west, feet to the east, the Christian orientation symbolic of facing the resurrection sun. No grave goods, no stone, just bone. But when DNA results returned, they struck like lightning. She was of European descent, and she was female. That eliminated the 1585 all-male expedition. Jamestown was ruled out too. They never settled this far inland. This woman didn't pass through. She lived and died, which meant others had too. For centuries, the legend of Roanoke painted a picture of complete disappearance. But now, one grave rewrote the script. "This is terrifying," whispered an archaeologist. Not because we found her, but because we now know she wasn't alone. The colonists had not all died. They had not been wiped out in one fell strike. They had fractured, moved, survived. Two paths now branched from the truth, two destinations, two possible fates. The evidence suggested a split migration. One group, practical or desperate, traveled southeast to Hatteras Island, to Croatan. There they might have found shelter. English tools, European ceramics, and genetic echoes in today's indigenous families all pointed that way. Croatan, known for its openness, may have offered them uneasy refuge. But this wasn't ambition. It was surrender. Quiet, inevitable, and costly. The others vanished inland, toward the forested edges of Metaquem. Why? Perhaps for isolation. Perhaps to disappear. They may have hoped to escape rescue or record. It wasn't strategy, it was survival. Crops had failed, disease had spread, hunger had taken hold. The threat of violence loomed from both Spanish forces and hostile tribes. But perhaps the deadliest force of all was fear. When fear took hold, trust collapsed. When unity dissolved, so did the colony. So they fled, not as one, but in fragments. Some to the coast, some to the woods, and all into silence. Roanoke's story is no longer one of disappearance. It's a mirror, a caution, a legacy written in disappearing ink. For centuries, we filed it away as an unsolved curiosity, but Roanoke is more than that. It is the unspoken prologue of America, a tale not erased for lack of meaning, but because no one bothered to listen. Within that silence lies horror, but also defiance. These were people who crossed an ocean to forge something new. And when the world turned on them, they did not vanish, they endured. Quietly, desperately. This is a story about survival and its cost, of cultures that met, clashed, and ultimately blended, of how memory fades without markers, no statues, no graves, only a single carved word, Croatoan, a monument of absence. What's most terrifying isn't that we didn't know, it's that we nearly never asked. For centuries, truth slept beneath roots and rivers, ignored. But in 2025, science finally listened. Genetic testing, ground scans, oral traditions, long dismissed. All converged into a single, chilling conclusion. They weren't lost, we just stopped listening. And what we nearly lost wasn't just a colony, it was our willingness to remember, our ability to trace vanished footsteps. Because if Roanoke could be forgotten this easily, who else has been? That is Roanoke's true legacy, not disappearance, but how willingly we erased it. What if they were never lost, just waiting to be found?